The Awakening. The vast, lifeless terrain of Zany 3 sprawled endlessly beneath a bruised orange sky. The ground was cracked and dry, scorched by the twin suns that blazed relentlessly above. Wind howled through the jagged rock formations, kicking up dust in every direction, and the air tasted of salt and something else, something faintly metallic. It was a world that seemed to have been forgotten by time itself, as though it existed only for the storm-ravaged winds and the endless cycles of barren seasons. Kian, a 14-year-old boy from the nearby village of Irith, moved with determination through this unforgiving landscape. His boots scraped the rocky ground as he trekked forward, the weight of his small satchel pressing against his side. Inside it, only a few slices of stale bread and strips of dried meat, a humble lunch for an explorer. He wasn't afraid of this harsh world or its desolate stretches of land. In fact, he thrived on the challenge, on the thrill of discovering what lay beyond the safety of the village walls. Clutched in his other hand was his father's old data tablet, its screen flickering intermittently as he scanned the map. His father, a seasoned trader, had drawn countless routes across the dangerous planet, and Kian had taken to following them for adventure. The thrill of uncovering hidden caves or long-forgotten ruins was what kept him going, even in the oppressive heat of Zany 3's never-ending day. He knew that beyond the wide, barren valleys and the cracked mountain ranges, there were mysteries waiting to be unlocked. The wind shifted suddenly, the familiar howl of the storm picking up speed. Kian paused, feeling the change in the air. He squinted into the horizon, where dark clouds gathered in the distance, a reminder of Zany 3's volatile nature. But it wasn't the storm that had drawn his attention. It was the gorge ahead, a dark, foreboding ravine that stretched far beyond his usual explorations. It had always called to him, beckoning with a promise of secrets buried deep within its shadows. Today, Kian decided, was the day he would venture into the unknown. As he approached the gorge, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thicker, heavier, filled with the sharp scent of sulfur, a smell that Kian hadn't encountered before. His heart raced with excitement as he carefully made his way into the narrow path. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the feeling of something ancient and powerful lay just beyond the bend. The wind had died down, and the silence was almost oppressive, like the whole world was holding its breath. Kian crept forward, his feet crunching softly on the loose gravel. The deeper he went into the gorge, the more the sense of unease wrapped around him. The gorge's walls rose high, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, like the fingers of something lurking just out of sight. But nothing could prepare him for what he would find. Turning a sharp corner, Kian stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. There, sprawled across the cracked earth, was a massive creature. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a pile of twisted, blackened scales. It was enormous, easily larger than any animal he had ever seen, and its wings were spread out, twisted at odd angles, crumpled beneath it like broken pieces of parchment. For a long moment, Kian didn't know what to think. The stories he had heard growing up, tales of a deadly ancient predator known as Sarno, rushed to the front of his mind. He had always thought of it as a legend, a creature of unimaginable strength, said to rain terror across the galaxy. Yet here it was, in front of him, withering away in the dust. The creature's eyes flickered open then, molten gold staring into Kian's soul, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something. It wasn't rage or aggression that radiated from its gaze, but a quiet, agonizing desperation. It was as though it was begging for something Kian couldn't understand. Instinctively, Kian took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. His curiosity overpowered his fear. He had never expected to find a creature like this. "Are you alive?" he whispered, unsure if the dragon could even hear him. Its labored breathing was the only response, the sound heavy with pain. Kian swallowed hard, the reality of what he was witnessing sinking in. The dragon wasn't just legendary. It was a living, breathing being, one that was suffering. He had heard the tales of Sarno, the fiercest of predators, but this wasn't the unstoppable beast of those stories. It was weak, starving, on the brink of death. With trembling hands, Kyan reached into his satchel and pulled out a piece of dry bread. It was all he had left, but something inside him urged him to offer it. He extended the bread cautiously, his fingers shaking. "I don't have much," he said quietly, "but you can have this." For a long moment, the dragon didn't move. Kyan feared it might never respond. But then, with slow, deliberate motions, the dragon lifted its massive head. Its nostrils flared, and Kyan instinctively stepped back, watching in awe as the creature sniffed the bread. There was something almost gentle in the way it moved. It wasn't the terrifying, violent dragon he had imagined, but a creature desperate for survival. And then, to his astonishment, the dragon opened its mouth and took the bread with delicate care. Kyan flinched, half expecting the beast to snap its jaws shut and attack. But instead, it chewed slowly, as though savoring the small morsel. As it swallowed with visible effort, the dragon's eyes met his again. This time, there was something else in them. Something soft, almost grateful. Kyan felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He had just fed a dragon, one of the deadliest creatures to ever walk the stars, and it had accepted his offering. This wasn't fear. This wasn't the hunger for battle that he had imagined. This was something entirely different. The dragon let out a low rumble, a sound that wasn't a growl but more like a sigh. It lowered its massive head to the ground, its eyelids fluttering as though the act of eating had drained what little energy it had left. It was clear now. The dragon wasn't the monster of the legends. It was a dying creature, one that had been brought low by time, hunger, and isolation. Kyan stepped closer, drawn by a sense of empathy he couldn't explain. "What happened to you?" he murmured, more to himself than the dragon. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but Kyan didn't need words to understand the truth. This dragon, once the galaxy's fiercest predator, was now helpless, and Kyan knew, deep down, that he couldn't leave it to die alone in the desolate gorge. Something about the creature's suffering called to him, a plea he could not ignore. He stood, his mind racing with possibilities. "I'll come back," he thought. "I'll bring more food. You need it." As he turned to leave, Kyan glanced back. The dragon's molten eyes followed him, glowing faintly in the dim light. He didn't know why he felt the need to help this creature, but he was certain of one thing. His journey into the gorge had only just begun. The promise. The trek back to the village seemed endless. Kyan's footsteps echoed through the gorge as the weight of the encounter pressed on him. The bread, his last meal for the day, had been offered without hesitation, but the actions that followed were far from simple. He had given food to a dying dragon, a creature that was once considered the terror of the galaxy, and in return, it had accepted his offer with surprising gentleness. The image of those molten gold eyes, filled not with anger but with a strange gratitude, stayed with him. Kyan couldn't shake the thought of the dragon, weak and starving, lying helplessly in the shadow of the gorge. It was so different from the stories. The dragon wasn't the fierce, untamable monster that the elders warned children about. It was an ancient, broken creature on the brink of death. As he walked, Kyan's mind churned with questions. What had happened to it? The stories never mentioned a time when Sarno, the deadly dragon, had been anything but a terror. How did a creature like that end up in this condition? Kyan reached the outskirts of Irith, his village perched on the edge of Zany III's rocky terrain. The sight of home brought little comfort, though. His mind was still occupied with the dragon, and he felt torn between the safety of the village and the pull of the gorge, where the dragon waited. He had promised to return, to bring more food, but the weight of that promise felt like a burden now. What would he be getting himself into? Was he inviting danger by returning? Could he really help a creature like that? He couldn't deny the way the dragon's eyes had fixed on him, though. There was something in that look, something that held him captive. It wasn't just hunger he had seen in the dragon's gaze, but a silent plea for understanding, for compassion. I can't just leave it there, Cian thought. He knew he had to go back, no matter what. When he arrived home, his mother, Arya, greeted him with a tired smile. She had been worried, of course. He'd been gone longer than usual. Cian could see the lines of concern etched into her face as she reached for his satchel to check if he had brought anything back from his journey. "Did you find anything interesting today, Cian?" she asked, her voice soft yet filled with an undercurrent of curiosity. Cian hesitated, his thoughts still racing. He could lie, tell her that he had just been exploring, that he had found nothing of importance. But something about this encounter, something about the dragon, made him feel that he couldn't just brush it off. His mother had always taught him that truth was vital, even when it was hard to accept. And what he had found today, what he had encountered, was no ordinary discovery. "I found something, but I don't know if I should have," Cian said slowly. He had never been the type to hesitate when it came to talking with his mother, but this felt different. Arya raised an eyebrow, a mixture of concern and curiosity crossing her face. "What do you mean? You're worrying me, Cian." Cian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I found a dragon," he said, watching her reaction closely. "A real one. Sarno." The mention of Sarno made Arya freeze, her expression hardening for a brief moment before she spoke. "Sarno, the deadliest of all creatures in the galaxy." Her voice held a mixture of awe and disbelief. Cian nodded, a heavy feeling settling in his stomach. "It wasn't what I thought it would be. It's starving, weak. I gave it some of my food." Arya's eyes widened. "Cian, do you realize what you've done? That creature is the stuff of nightmares. It's one of the oldest, most feared beings in the galaxy." "I know," Cian replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's not what the stories say. It's dying. I think it's been abandoned, or maybe it's just too old to survive on its own. I couldn't just leave it there." His mother took a deep breath, her expression softening as she studied her son. "You have a good heart, Cian," she said, "but you're also young. You can't make promises to something like that. It's dangerous. You don't know what that creature is capable of when it's desperate." "I don't care," Cian said, his tone firm despite the doubt that gnawed at him. "I promised it I'd come back with more food. I have to go." Arya's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, as though weighing his words. Finally, she sighed. "If you must go, then go. But promise me you'll be careful. You're not alone in this, Cian, and whatever happens, you'll have us to come back to." Cian nodded, though part of him wasn't sure if he would be able to keep his promise. Returning to the gorge meant facing the unknown, venturing back into the heart of a desolate alien world. And yet, the pull to help the dragon was stronger than his fear. He had seen it in its eyes, that silent plea, that hope. He couldn't turn his back on it. That night, Cian couldn't sleep. The promise weighed heavily on him, but he knew what he had to do. The morning would come soon enough, and with it, his journey back to the gorge. As dawn broke, Cian gathered his things. He had packed the last of his food, hoping it would be enough. There was no telling how long it would take for him to find more sustenance for the dragon. He didn't even know if it would still be alive when he returned. Before he left, Cian stood at the edge of his village, gazing out at the dark horizon. The winds had shifted again, and the storm clouds gathered in the distance. But Cian wasn't concerned about the weather. He had a mission now, one that would lead him deeper into the unknown, where danger and mystery awaited. "I'll be back soon," he whispered to the wind, more to himself than anyone else. And with that, Cian set out again, back toward the gorge, back toward the dragon that had captured his heart. There was no turning back now. Into the heart of the gorge. The sun had barely risen when Cian set out once more toward the gorge. The air was cool and crisp, and the early morning fog clung to the jagged rocks like a shroud, making the landscape feel even more alien. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, as though nature itself was uncertain about what would happen next. Kian couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him since his first encounter with the dragon. The weight of his promise had transformed from a simple act of compassion into something much more profound, something that tied him irrevocably to the ancient creature he had found. The path leading to the gorge was familiar to Kian, but today it felt different. He couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that the very earth beneath his boots was watching him, as though the landscape itself was aware of the impossible journey he had undertaken. The wind, which had always been a constant companion on these rocky hills, seemed to whisper warnings in his ear, carrying the scent of sulfur and decay. The gorge stretched before him, a jagged scar in the landscape that led down into a shadowy realm of forgotten secrets and buried dangers. Kian's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear as he descended into the depths. Every step felt heavier than the last, but the promise he had made to the dragon pushed him forward, guiding him like an invisible tether. The dragon needed him. He knew that much. As Kian neared the bend where he had first seen the creature, he slowed his pace. His eyes scanned the shadowed corners of the gorge, searching for any sign of movement. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the dragon's massive form sprawled across the rocky floor, just as he had left it. The creature's obsidian scales glistened faintly in the dim light, still dulled by the dust of its long suffering. Its wings, once magnificent and powerful, now lay in ruins, their membranes torn and ragged. The dragon's once fiery eyes were now dim, almost lifeless. But then, as Kian stepped closer, the creature's eyes flickered open, and Kian's heart skipped a beat. They were still the same molten gold eyes, but they held something new, an unreadable depth of emotion. The dragon's gaze met Kian's, and for a moment, it was as if the entire world stood still. There was no sound, no movement, just the shared connection between boy and beast. It was a moment that transcended everything Kian had known before. This wasn't just a dragon. It was a living, breathing being with its own story, its own pain, and its own need for help. Kian knelt cautiously, still holding the satchel of bread in his hands. He hadn't brought much this time, just the last of his supplies. It wasn't enough to sustain the dragon for long, but it was all he had. He had to make it count. "Here," Kian said softly, his voice trembling slightly. He extended the bread toward the dragon, who let out a low guttural growl, a sound more of hunger than a threat. The dragon's nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, and for a moment, Kian thought it might refuse the offering. But then, with surprising grace, the creature's massive head inched closer, its eyes never leaving Kian's as it took the bread from his hands. Kian's heart swelled with relief, but that relief was fleeting. As the dragon chewed, its movements slow and labored, Kian noticed something else. Its body was far weaker than he had realized. The once imposing muscles were now little more than skin and bone. The dragon's ribs protruded sharply beneath its scales, and its breaths came in shallow, rasping gasps. It was clear that the creature hadn't just been starved for a few days. It had been starving for a long time. Kian couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had brought so little. Was it enough? Would it make a difference? He had no way of knowing how long it would take for the dragon to recover, or if it ever would. The dragon finished the bread, licking its lips with a slow, deliberate motion before shifting its gaze back to Kian. There was a strange warmth in its eyes now, a flicker of something that could almost be called trust. For a moment, Kian forgot the danger that the creature represented. He forgot the stories he had heard as a child, the warnings of the elders. In that instant, the dragon was no longer a deadly monster. It was a fragile, suffering being, and Kian couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for it. "Why are you here?" Kian whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "What happened to you?" The dragon didn't answer, of course. It couldn't. But as it lay there, its massive head resting on the ground, Kian felt as though the creature was sharing something with him. A story not told with words, but with the weight of its existence. A story of survival, of suffering, and perhaps of loss. Kian sat back on his heels, still watching the dragon closely. He knew he couldn't help it alone. This was bigger than just feeding it. The dragon needed more than food. It needed care, it needed healing, and it needed time. And Kian wasn't sure if he was capable of giving it any of that. But what choice did he have? He had made a promise, and he couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when he had seen the creature's desperation, its pain, and its quiet plea for help. The dragon shifted slightly, its enormous wings twitching, though they were too weak to move fully. The sight sent a shiver down Kian's spine. It was impossible to ignore the fact that the creature was slowly dying. Yet it wasn't just a dragon that lay before him. It was a symbol of something greater. It was a reminder of the fragility of all life, of how even the most powerful beings could fall to despair. And Kian, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, felt compelled to save it. "I'll come back," he promised again, more to himself than to the dragon. "I'll bring more food, and maybe I can find a way to help you." The dragon's eyes closed slowly, as if accepting Kian's words as the only hope it had left. The creature let out a low sigh, almost like a soft, defeated rumble. Kian took one last, lingering look at the dragon's battered form before standing up. He didn't know if his promise would be enough, but he had made it, and he intended to keep it. As he turned to leave, Kian felt a strange pull in his chest. It wasn't just the responsibility of keeping his word. It was something deeper, something that bound him to the dragon in a way that was beyond understanding. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Kian knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just trying to save a dying creature. He was embarking on something far greater. This was a journey that would change him, shape him, and lead him to places he couldn't yet imagine. And as he left the gorge behind, the wind carried a single, haunting sound. The soft, mournful cry of a creature that had once ruled the skies, now lost and searching for its place in the world. A promise under the stars. Kian returned to the gorge the following evening, his heart heavy with a mix of determination and uncertainty. The day had passed in a blur, filled with preparations and questions that he had no answers to. He couldn't shake the image of the dragon's fragile body, its ribs jutting painfully beneath its cracked scales, its wings unable to unfurl. The creature had accepted his offer of food, but that act had only revealed how dire the situation truly was. This wasn't just about feeding the dragon. It was about saving a creature on the brink of extinction, and Kian wasn't sure if he was even capable of such a thing. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky full of stars, their distant lights twinkling like scattered gems. The cold wind swept through the valley, but Kian barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of the dragon, and the promise he had made. He had returned to the village that afternoon to gather more supplies, but something inside him told him that food wasn't enough. The dragon needed more, much more, than just bread and water. Kian's journey wasn't only about saving a dying creature. It had become about understanding what had driven the dragon to this point, and how he, a simple boy from a quiet village, could make a difference. As he walked down the narrow path toward the gorge, the landscape around him seemed to come alive in the dim light. The rocks seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the wind carried a low hum that set Kian's nerves on edge. There was something ancient about this place, something powerful. He felt as though the land itself was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. When he reached the bend in the gorge, the dragon was there, just as he had left it. The creature's massive form was sprawled across the rocky floor, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The soft glow of the stars reflected off its dull scales, making it appear almost ethereal in the moonlight. Kian's breath caught in his throat as he approached, and for a moment, he was struck by how vulnerable the dragon appeared. The creature's eyes opened slowly as Kian knelt beside it. Those molten gold eyes fixed on him once again, their intensity both awe-inspiring and humbling. The dragon had accepted his first offering, but now, it was clear that it was still weak, still on the edge of survival. Kian felt a pang of guilt, knowing that his meager supplies wouldn't be enough to heal the dragon's wounds. It wasn't just food the creature needed. It needed care. It needed to regain its strength. And Kian had no idea how to give it what it truly required. But he couldn't turn back now. He had made a promise. "Hello again," Kian whispered softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. He felt foolish speaking to the creature, knowing it couldn't respond, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. The dragon's eyes shifted slightly, its massive head lifting just enough for Kian to see the faintest glimmer of recognition. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. He opened his satchel, pulling out a handful of dried herbs he had collected earlier that day. He had no way of knowing if these herbs would be of any use to the dragon, but something told him that they might help in some way. He carefully placed the herbs near the creature's snout, watching as the dragon sniffed the air. For a moment, the dragon's nostrils flared, its eyes focusing on the herbs with a curiosity that Kian had not expected. Then, to his surprise, the dragon inhaled deeply, its massive body trembling slightly as it exhaled. Kian wasn't sure if the herbs were doing anything, but he couldn't stop himself from trying. He mixed the herbs with water, creating a thick paste, and gently applied it to the dragon's cracked scales. He worked slowly and carefully, his fingers trembling as he touched the creature's fragile skin. The dragon didn't flinch, but it didn't move either. It lay there, silent, allowing Kian to continue his work. For what felt like hours, Kian tended to the dragon, applying the mixture of herbs and water, wiping away the dust that had accumulated on the creature's scales. He had no training in healing or medicine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something he had to do. The dragon had been kind to him in its own way, accepting his offering and showing a flicker of trust. And that trust, fragile as it was enough to keep him going. When the herbs were applied and the water had been absorbed, Kian sat back on his heels, exhausted but satisfied. He looked down at the dragon, who had not moved from its position, but whose breathing seemed a little less labored. It wasn't much, but it was something. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. He needed to return to the village and gather more supplies. But there was a bond now, one that he couldn't deny. The dragon wasn't just some mythical creature from old stories anymore. It was real, and it was hurting. And somehow, Kian had become a part of its story. "I'll be back," Kian promised again, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that still gnawed at him. "I'll bring more food. I'll find a way to help you." For a brief moment, the dragon's gaze softened, and Kian thought he saw a flicker of gratitude in its eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. He stood slowly, his body aching from the long hours of tending to the dragon. He turned to leave, but as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. The wind shifted, and for a brief moment, Kian thought he heard a whisper. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, distant but clear, calling out to him. The sound sent a chill down his spine, but when he turned to look, the gorge was empty. The dragon lay in the same spot, its golden eyes now closed, but there was a sense of peace about it, a tranquility that hadn't been there before. Kian's mind raced as he made his way back up the gorge. What was that sound? Who or what had spoken to him? He couldn't explain it, but somehow, deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger than he could have ever imagined. The night was dark, and the stars seemed to burn brighter in the sky as he walked, his mind heavy with thoughts of the dragon and the strange whisper that had followed him. There was no turning back now. Kian had made a promise, and no matter what lay ahead, he would keep it. He would save the dragon, no matter the cost. And as he looked up at the stars, a sense of purpose settled within him. The journey ahead would be long, difficult, and filled with dangers. But for the first time, Kian felt ready to face it. The unseen forces. Days turned into weeks, and Kian's visits to the gorge became a routine, one that he clung to with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Every evening, he would gather what he could, more herbs, more food, more water, and venture back into the valley. Each time, the dragon greeted him with the same weary gaze, its eyes dimmed by exhaustion, but still filled with the same flicker of recognition, of trust. The bond between them, though fragile, had only grown stronger. But despite Kian's best efforts, the dragon's condition seemed to stagnate. It wasn't getting worse, but it wasn't getting better either. Its once majestic wings remained crumpled and weak, and its scales were still cracked and brittle. The creature's breath, though less labored than before, was still shallow, and its movements were slow and deliberate, as if each one took an immense amount of energy. Kian could feel the weight of its suffering, and it gnawed at him each time he left the gorge, knowing he hadn't done enough. But what more could he do? He was just a boy. How could he, with his limited knowledge and resources, hope to save something as grand and powerful as the dragon? On the evening of the fourth week, Kian found himself standing at the edge of the gorge once more, the familiar weight of the satchel on his shoulder. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with an energy Kian couldn't explain. The wind had died down, leaving the valley eerily still. The stars above seemed brighter, more vivid than they had ever been, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Kian paused, a chill running down his spine. There was something in the air, something he couldn't see, but could certainly feel. He wasn't alone. As he stepped forward, the sensation grew stronger, and Kian couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the dragon's resting place, and when he rounded the bend, the sight before him took his breath away. The dragon was standing. Its massive form loomed tall against the dim light of the stars. Its wings, though still tattered, began to twitch, as if they were awakening after years of dormancy. The creature's molten gold eyes, once dull with hunger and fatigue, now shimmered with an intensity that almost seemed unnatural. It turned its head toward Kian, its gaze piercing through the darkness, and for a moment, Kian was frozen. It wasn't the same dragon he had been tending to. This was something else entirely. Something more. Alive. What? What's happening? Kian whispered, his voice barely audible in the heavy silence. The dragon did not respond, but it didn't need to. Kian could feel it. The shift in the air, the crackling energy around them. It was as though the very earth itself had come alive, responding to the dragon's awakening. Kian's thoughts raced. Was this the result of the herbs he had applied? Was the dragon healing on its own? Or was something more mysterious at play here, something far beyond his understanding? Before he could take another step, a low rumbling sound filled the air, emanating from deep within the dragon's chest. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was something deeper, something ancient. The ground beneath Kian's feet trembled slightly, and he staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. The dragon's wings unfurled slightly, the ragged edges of the membranes flapping gently, as if stretching for the first time in ages. Kian had never seen anything like this before. The creature's breath quickened, and then, for the first time, it spoke. It was a voice, deep and resonant, echoing in Kian's mind rather than his ears. "Why do you help me, human?" Kian's throat tightened at the sound of the voice, a voice that was both familiar and otherworldly. He had heard of telepathic communication, but he had never imagined it would be like this, so direct, so powerful. He didn't know how to respond. The question itself seemed so simple, but the weight of it was immense. I don't know," Kian stammered, his voice shaking. I couldn't just leave you to die. You're not just some beast. I couldn't let you suffer like that." The dragon's eyes glowed faintly as it considered his words, the deep intelligence behind them shining through. "You are different from the others," the dragon said, its voice like a distant storm, powerful and yet strangely calming. "Most would have fled at the sight of me. Most would have feared what I am. But you, human, you have shown me something I have not felt in ages. Compassion. I have not known it in so long. Kian felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For a moment, he wondered if the dragon was truly speaking to him, or if he was just imagining it. But there was no mistaking the clarity in the creature's words, no mistaking the depth of understanding between them. I made a promise, Kian said, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. I told you I would come back. And I will. I'll find a way to help you. The dragon let out a deep, rumbling sigh, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Kian's feet. Your kindness, it has given me the strength I have lost. But this is not just about food or herbs, human. There is more to my suffering than you know. More to my story. Kian felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? What happened to you? The dragon's eyes glinted in the starlight, and for a moment, Kian thought he saw something akin to sorrow in them. I was once a guardian of the skies, protector of worlds. I was revered and feared in equal measure, but even the strongest fall. And I fell. There are forces at work in this galaxy, forces beyond your comprehension, and I have been cast aside, forgotten by those who once relied on me. Kian's mind raced. He had heard whispers of powerful beings, ancient guardians and protectors, but he had never truly believed them. Could this dragon be one of them? Could it be that the creature he had been helping was not just a predator, but something far more significant? I don't understand, Kian said, his voice filled with uncertainty. Who cast you aside? Why? The dragon's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the fierce intensity in its eyes dimmed. There are those who seek to control the galaxy, human. Those who would do anything to wield power. They sought to use me, to bend me to their will. When I refused, they stripped me of my power, left me to starve. Kian's heart clenched at the dragon's words. He had never considered that the galaxy was filled with such dark forces, forces that would go to any lengths to exploit the creatures that lived within it. But I can't do this alone, the dragon continued, its voice carrying a sense of finality. There is a balance that must be restored, and you, human, are the key. Kian blinked in surprise. What do you mean? I'm just a boy. What could I possibly do? The dragon's eyes gleamed with an ancient wisdom, a knowledge Kian could never hope to fully understand. You have something they do not. Something that cannot be controlled, cannot be bent to the will of others. You have hope, human, and that is why you will help me. Together, we will restore the balance. Together, we will stop those who seek to dominate. Kian stood frozen, the weight of the dragon's words settling in his chest. He had come to the gorge to help a dying creature, but now he found himself entangled in something far bigger than he had ever imagined. There was a larger fight at play, one that threatened the very fabric of the galaxy itself. And somehow, he had become a part of it. With the dragon by his side, Kian knew his life had changed forever. The question now wasn't whether he could help the dragon. It was whether he was ready to face the challenges ahead, to stand against the darkness that loomed on the horizon. The journey had only just begun, the awakening of strength. The nights had grown colder since Kian's last visit. The winds, once gentle and predictable, now howled through the valley with an eerie intensity. Kian could sense that something in the world around him had shifted, a palpable change, as though the very air had thickened, charged with anticipation. He had left the village behind, his mind swirling with thoughts of the dragon's words, the promises that now tethered him to something far greater than himself. He had known the galaxy was vast, filled with mysteries that humans like him could scarcely understand. But he had never expected to be caught up in one of those mysteries. The dragon's plea for help, its call for restoration, had stirred something deep within Kian. The journey he was about to embark on would not just be about saving a dying creature. It would be about uncovering the hidden forces of the galaxy and learning what it truly meant to be human. Kian arrived at the gorge just before sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The valley lay in shadow, with only the faintest glimmer of starlight illuminating the rocky landscape. But today, The air felt different. There was an odd stillness to everything, as if the world itself were holding its breath. As Kian descended into the gorge, his heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the dragon's presence before he even saw it. The air around him grew warmer, and the ground beneath his boots hummed with a strange energy. The dragon was near, but what he saw when he rounded the bend made him stop in his tracks. The dragon was standing tall, its massive form silhouetted against the dimming sky. The creature's wings, though still battered, now spread wide, catching the last light of the day. The scales that had once seemed so fragile and broken now gleamed, reflecting the soft starlight. There was a new strength in the dragon's posture, a power that hadn't been there before. Kian's breath caught in his throat as he realized just how much the dragon had changed. You've healed," Kian whispered, his voice barely audible. The dragon's molten eyes turned toward him, glowing with a fierce intensity. "I have not healed entirely, human," the dragon's voice echoed in Kian's mind. "But I have regained a part of what was lost. It is enough to begin." Kian stepped forward, a mixture of awe and uncertainty filling him. "What do you mean, enough to begin?" The dragon's wings fluttered slightly, a sound like a low rumble, almost as if it were stretching its muscles for the first time in ages. The journey ahead is not just about survival. It is about restoring what has been broken. There is much you do not yet understand, Kian. Forces in this galaxy are shifting, and you have become part of that shift. Kian felt a chill run down his spine. What had he gotten himself into? He had come here to help a wounded creature, but now he was entangled in something much larger than he had ever imagined. The stakes were higher than he had thought. But still, he felt an unexplainable pull to this dragon, this guardian of the skies. The trust in its eyes, the hope in its voice, it was something Kian couldn't ignore. "What is it you need me to do?" Kian asked, the words slipping from his lips before he could even think them through. The dragon shifted its weight, its massive head lowering so that its eyes were level with Kian's. "I need you to believe in what I have to offer, to believe in what humanity is capable of." Kian blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? You've been through so much, and yet you're asking me to believe in something as intangible as that." The dragon's eyes softened, and for the briefest moment, Kian saw something in them that made his heart ache. "You misunderstand, human. It is not just about belief in me. It is about believing in your own strength, your own purpose. I have watched as you gave what little you had to me, not out of fear or obligation, but because you saw something beyond the surface. You are capable of so much more than you know." Kian shook his head, trying to understand. He was just a boy. How could he possibly be capable of anything as great as what the dragon seemed to suggest? He was no warrior, no protector. He didn't have the power or the knowledge to face whatever threats lurked in the darkness of the galaxy. The dragon's voice broke through his thoughts, firm yet gentle. "The path ahead will not be easy. You will face challenges that will test your courage, your resolve, and your very sense of self. But you are not alone. I will be with you, guiding you, as will others you will meet along the way." Kian's mind raced. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, so many things he didn't understand. But deep down, he knew that the answers wouldn't come easily. The dragon's words had struck a chord within him. It wasn't just about helping the dragon anymore. It was about something bigger, something that called to him from the very core of his being. "I'm ready," Kian said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The dragon's molten eyes gleamed with something like pride. "Good. Then the first step begins now." With a great heave, the dragon's wings unfurled completely, the leathery membranes stretching to their full span. Kian stepped back, watching in awe as the dragon seemed to rise, its massive form towering over him. It wasn't just the dragon that had changed. It was the world around them, too. The valley, once desolate and lonely, now felt charged with an unseen force, the very air humming with energy. "There is a place," the dragon's voice echoed in Kian's mind, "a place where answers await. It is far from here, deep in the heart of the galaxy. But first, you must understand what is at stake. The forces that brought me to this state are not the only ones who seek to control what is sacred. There are others who will stop at nothing to bend the universe to their will, and they will not rest until they have claimed everything they desire. Kian's stomach churned. The dragon was talking about something far beyond the conflict he had imagined. This wasn't just about survival. It was about saving everything, about preventing forces from seizing control of the galaxy itself. We must find the source of their power, Kian. Only then can we hope to stop them. Kian nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation more clearly than ever before. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a part of something greater, something that would determine the future of the galaxy. And somehow, the dragon had chosen him to stand beside it. As the dragon unfurled its wings, Kian took a deep breath. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges and dangers he couldn't yet comprehend, but he was no longer afraid. He had made a promise, and he would keep it, no matter the cost. With a final glance at the dragon, Kian followed as it took to the skies, the winds catching its wings and lifting it higher into the night. The stars above shimmered brightly, as if the universe itself were watching, waiting for the story to unfold. The fight for the galaxy had begun, and Kian was ready to face whatever came next.